Hey, welcome. Today we're going to be talking through macromolecules. What I mean by that are lipids, carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids, and solubility issues, like what kinds of molecules will dissolve into what solvents. And so that's the goal. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we do need to talk about these macromolecules. The very first one to talk about in terms of a category of macromolecules are called lipids. So lipids are fats, waxes, and oils. They are nonpolar, generally not soluble in water, or polar solvents. So hold on, wait a sec. You may not remember exactly what I'm talking about or know what I'm going to be talking about. So let's do a quick overview and review of some of the material that we have talked about in the past. I will also put a link up to my previous screencast on polar molecules. So first of all, water is a polar molecule. That means these are polar covalent bonds right here between the oxygen and the hydrogen. And that's because the oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen is. So yes, they do share electrons between them. Polar covalent is the type of bond we're talking about, but it's an unequal sharing of electrons in the sense that oxygen pulls more strongly on those electrons than hydrogen does, which makes those polar bonds. And it also makes this partially positive charge over here. The oxygen is going to be partially negative charged. And that also explains why water can attract itself, essentially. Water does well with itself, and that's because you've got hydrogen bonds right here, these temporary interactions between the partial positive charges of one hydrogen atom from one molecule and the oxygen atom of another molecule. So that's what we had talked about with polar molecules, and we had said that polar molecules dissolve in other polar molecules, and this is what we mean by this. Like right here you can see ammonia. And we can say that molecules like this are also said to be hydrophilic or water-loving. And then we also said that ionic compounds can be dissolved in polar molecules as well. So if you have like a salt, like magnesium oxide, that can be pulled apart and readily dissolved in water. You know this. You've seen water dissolve things like salt before with no problem. But there is one more situation that doesn't work well, and that's when you have water or polar molecules interacting with nonpolar molecules. So something like methane or other nonpolar molecules where the electronegativities between the atoms involved are very similar, and as a result the electrons are shared very, very evenly. As a result, there's no partial positive or negative charges associated with something like this. And they don't mix well. We've all seen this before. We've all seen water and oil not mixing before. And that background information is going to help us to understand the issues that we're going to be talking about today. The next thing I need to address is what do we mean by a monomer? What do we mean by a polymer? So a monomer is a small repeating molecule, a single unit, whereas a polymer is a long chain of monomers put together. So it's like this is one monomer. You can see a few of these put together here. And so one example of this is if you thought of a train and its train cars and think about what would be the monomer and what would be the polymer. Well, the train cars would be the monomers, and put together into the train itself would be the polymer, so to speak. I just want you to know these terms so when I start using them here, you'll know what I'm talking about. Alright, a little more about lipids before we move on. Lipids are fats, waxes, and oils. The difference between those three things, more or less, is whether they are solid or liquid at room temperature and pressure. Lipids are largely nonpolar. Sometimes they have a polar ends. Like one side of it will be polar, like we have over here, for instance. And so they are able to be dissolved in nonpolar substances, but they don't dissolve well in polar substances. Like we said, oil and water don't mix. Now, there are exceptions to this where one side of this, like with a phospholipid, for instance, can have a polar head or a polar end. And so one side of the lipid molecule can be soluble in polar molecules like water, whereas the other side will not. And that's really, really crucial for life. While we're talking about this, even though this is a chemistry topic, it's so important in biology that we need to talk about it right here real quick. So phospholipids, what they can do is self-assemble, where the polar outside or the polar head can all interact with each other and interact with the outside. It can start to form something called a liposome if it's small enough. Or if you take a look over here, if you think about a cell, and if you zoom in, you start looking at the cell membrane right here, zoom in even more, you end up with what's called a phospholipid bilayer. Zoom in even more over there, you end up with a phospholipid, and that's what I showed in the last slide, and it's also here. It's got a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. And so these will interact with water well, and these will not. These will stick together, kind of like you see over here. In fact, it's such an important process that it develops the entire cell membrane based on this. Alright, so let's take that info and go back over here with our original graphic that I'm going to build on. We're talking about lipids, and again we're saying that lipids are fats, waxes, and oils that are nonpolar, generally not soluble in water, or polar solvents. Alright, our second category that we need to talk about are our proteins. Proteins are made up by amino acids, so proteins would be the polymer, amino acids would be the monomer, and this is a general amino acid layout right here. Now the deal with that is that this is going to be a variable. So there are 20 different amino acids, and they all have different R groups down here. Think of this like an X in math, where that represents a variable. Now, some of those R groups are going to be polar, and some of those R groups are going to be nonpolar. So, in essence, proteins sometimes can be dissolved by polar molecules like water, sometimes they cannot. The next category we need to talk about are carbohydrates. You're all familiar with carbohydrates. There are a lot of carbohydrates in bread, for instance. And so you have these glucose molecules connected over here. This is lactose. But if you take a look here, it's got these OHs on the end of it. These are polar ends, so it turns out that carbohydrates, even though the long chain that we have right here isn't so soluble in polar solvents, because these are just carbons and hydrogens, it's the OHs on the end that allow carbohydrates to be soluble in water and other polar solvents. Lastly, we need to talk about DNA and RNA, which are called nucleic acids. They are definitely soluble in water and our polar molecules in general. Alright, and this is our graphic that I've been building up to overall. The general trends I'm going to show you right now is over here on this side of this graphic, everything is less soluble in water, like the lipids. As you know, water and oil don't mix, and then as you go towards the right, you get more and more soluble, like nucleic acids are very soluble in water. Alright, and one more thing I do want to talk about, and that is plastics. So plastics can either be nonpolar or polar. Polypropylene, which is a nonpolar plastic over here, it is essentially a polymer of carbon and hydrogen. So this is the monomer here, and it's essentially just carbon and hydrogen atoms bonded together in a long chain, a long polymer. That's what that is. Whereas nylon over here has other things embedded in it which make it more polar and able to be dissolved better or interact better with polar solvents. Alright, and this is one last summary here that I do want you to take a look at. This is really crucial. We've been building up to this. So I want you to think about this phrase that goes with this topic that we're talking about here, like dissolves like. You may have heard this from your teacher. And what does that mean exactly? Well, if you have a polar solvents, solvents are things that do the dissolving. And if you have a polar solute, that would be like the thing that is dissolved. So if you have both of them are like, then they will go together. They will dissolve. In other words, water will dissolve sugar. You may have seen that happen before. And so these are like each other. And so polar solvents will dissolve polar solutes. Let's take a look at our other like scenario. So if we have nonpolar mixed with nonpolar, that's over here. So nonpolar solutes going with nonpolar solvents, they are like each other. Both of them are nonpolar, and so it is true that nonpolar solvents will dissolve nonpolar solutes. Well, how about if they are unlike? Like if you have a polar solute and a nonpolar solvent like we would have over here, what would you think would happen? Well, it turns out that the solvent will not dissolve the solutes. They won't go together. This is harder to think about because you would have to have a nonpolar solvent like benzene. Well, we don't have that in our everyday life very often. But let me give you another example that's a little more common. So polar solvents will not dissolve nonpolar solutes. That is like our water and oil scenario right here. So hopefully that graphic is helpful to summarize what we're talking about and some really crucial ideas in chemistry. If you have any comments down below, please let me know. And I hope you all have a great day. Take care.